Okay, Mr. Nelson, you can still hear me? Mr. Nelson, are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I can.
So there's a little bit of a delay, and the jury is not in the room right now, so I just want to explain. When the state objects, you have to stop talking until the court rules. And I know it's difficult with the delay, so I'm going to try to maybe raise my... Can you see me? Are you able to see me if I raise my hand?
Just barely, but yes, I can see you. Yeah.
Okay, so if the state objects, I'm going to try to stop you like that so that you'll know that the judge needs to make a ruling. Is that all right?
Fine. Yes, fine.
Okay, I know it's difficult with the delay, but hopefully that'll be better.
Okay.
I think we're ready to bring in the jury.
Mr. Scott Nelson, did you have an opportunity to talk with your attorneys about what we discussed here at the bench?
They explained it to me in detail.
Okay, so you know your obligations in terms of courtroom decorum?
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Okay. All right, Ms. Simmons, is the defense ready to bring in the jury?
Yes.
Mr. Scott Nelson, are you ready to bring in the jury?
Yes, Your
Mr. Nunley, stay ready.
Honor. Yes, Your Honor.
All right, let's bring in the jury, please. Ms. Simmons, does the defense acknowledge the jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Scott Nelson, do you acknowledge the jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Nunley, state acknowledge the jury? Thank you. All right, Ms. Simmons, please continue.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Nelson, we were talking about your father being a perfectionist, and I want to ask you how did he treat you and your brothers based on his perfectionism?
It was very rare that something would meet his standards. It was always seemingly something he would find fault with, whether it was the way you looked, the way you were dressed, even the way you spoke sometimes.
Mr. Nelson, can you give me an example of a time when when this applied to your life with your father? Well, let me word it this way. You've mentioned a time when you wanted to go to your grandmother's funeral. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, my parents, following the divorce, my father's mother passed away. I had seen her almost every weekend of my life growing up until the divorce. So she was my grandmother, and I was really concerned. I heard not from my father, I heard from a relative on my mother's side of the family that she had passed away. So I called my father to offer my condolences and asked him when he was going down for the funeral. And he lived north of me, so he would have to go by my home when he went. And I thought maybe I could get a ride or something with me. And what his question to me was, not thank you for calling me to offer your condolences. He wanted to know about my weight. He goes, "Are you fat?" Because if I was fat, he wouldn't want me to go to the funeral because I would be seen by relatives, and he assumed that would reflect poorly upon him.
Okay. And Mr. Nelson, did your father ever show any affection to you, your brothers, or your mother?
I never once in my life saw my father or mother kiss, share any type of embrace, hold hands. Never once saw anything like that at all. My father, I can't really speak for my brothers. I don't think it was any different than it was for myself. As for me, though, the very rare opportunities my father would put his hand on my shoulder or give me a little hug, and it was usually following some incident where he was abusive, and he'd say to me as the oldest, he'd go, "Oh, come on, you know you're my number one son." And that was the extent of any affection he ever showed in the home.
And so because it was preceded by some sort of...
Well, either it would be an argument or a fight or...
Action.
Okay.
Abstain.
And so because it was preceded by something like an argument or a fight, did it seem genuine to you?
It never did. It never did. I think as a very young child, I had the hope that it meant something. But as I started to get older, I would see that it meant nothing whatsoever. And it was sort of, you don't want to push him away because it seemed very fake. It certainly wasn't real. And it felt obvious to me that it wasn't sincere.
Okay. And Mr. Nelson, did you all have any pets growing up?
We had a few pets. My father, again, did not particularly like animals because he felt they were dirty and they'd soil the house or something.
Okay,
But
so-
we did.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you tell me, was there a pattern with your father and the pets that you had as a child?
They would frequently disappear. We had a dog that had been hit by a car. It was a puppy. And soon afterwards, it had some accident with a bandage. And we came home from school one day and the dog was gone. And, you know, it went to live in that farm in the country. Who knows where it went?
And did Scott have a rabbit growing up?
Scott did have a rabbit that he cared for a great deal. It was a large white rabbit. Its name was Cotton. And Scott took care of it. And he paid a lot of attention to him and met something. Cotton lived in a hut that my father had built outdoors, so he wasn't in the house. And when we moved to New Hampshire, my Uncle Tom, my mother's brother, who we all felt a great deal for him, took Cotton and would send notes to my mother or Scott afterwards telling him what the rabbit was doing. That the rabbit ate carrots a particular day, or that he let the rabbit run around in his enclosed garden area or something like that. So,
And that was your Uncle Tom Broderick Sr.?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
And so you also mentioned that your father was physically abusive. Can you give me an
Yes.
example of how he was abusive to you?
Well, it ranged from slapping and pushing to where I was hit with a 2x4 on more than one occasion. He would throw things at you. He would get you into a corner and he would beat you with a belt, and he would hit you with the buckle end of the belt. I grew up hearing my mother would repeatedly be saying to my father when he was doing this, "Don't hit them in the head." My father just lost control and he'd just keep going and going, and apparently until he tired of doing it.
And were there times where he did something that seemed maybe like he could deny that it was abuse?
Objection, Charles, perspective, motion.
Could you read back the question?
And were there times when he did something that seems maybe like he could deny that it was abuse?
Sustain the objection to the form.
Were there times where there was abuse that was maybe less obvious? And if that doesn't make sense,
I'm not quite. Yes, if you could rephrase it, I'm not quite sure I understand.
right. So, well, let me back up a little bit and ask you: did your father ever leave visible injuries to your face or body?
Yes, on many occasions you'd have black and blue welts or something on your body, but one And one situation that particularly stands out in my mind was when I was a sophomore in high school, they were having a senior prom,
Objection.
and it was sort of an honor in the school to.
I'm sorry, Mr. Nelson. You can answer that question, but was there something specific that your father did physically to you?
Yeah, he punched me in the face when I had to make it. I was going to be making an appearance that night in a public situation, and it black and blued my face, and there were a number of occasions like that.
Did
you
your
know,
father, did your father ever? You said that he threw things at you. Can you give me an example of that?
it could be anything from an ashtray to he would throw hammers at people. By people, I mean we children, his children. Whatever was convenient, if he felt like it, that's what he would do.
Okay, and he did these things to you and your brother Robert?
Yes. Oh, yes.
And was Scott around to witness these acts?
When it was most prevalent, Scott was very small, so I don't know that it was something that he would recall having witnessed. I think that Scott did not get the physical abuse, and I can't be sure of that because I wasn't in the home all the time. But as I grew older, I'm a pretty big guy. I've been the same height since I was 12 years old. Since I and my brother Bob got older, I think my father, at least I was larger than, sort of became afraid because we started standing up and we're not going to be willing to let him continue that type of physical abuse anymore.
Okay, and when you started to stand up to your father, was that to protect yourself and your brother and your mother?
Oh, absolutely, my mother. I would think all of us rallied over our mother and were much more concerned about her than we were ourselves.
Can you give me an example of the type of things that your father would do to your mother in front of you?
I remember when my mother was carrying Scott, we were out and we were going by this Dairy Queen ice cream place, and my mother wanted to get this drink called an orange freeze, and my father didn't want her for whatever reason to have it. And he pulled in, like tore the car off the road, slammed the car into the parking lot, and started hitting her. And my mother she was probably about 7 months pregnant at the time.
With Scott?
With Scott, yes.
Okay.
And, yeah.
And were there times, we were talking about you standing up for her, was there a time when you had to do that you can remember?
Yeah, one time my mother was rarely sick where she would go to the hospital with a physical complaint. And one evening she hadn't been feeling well at all, and she wanted to go to see a doctor, which again was not something she wanted to do. And my father said, well, you can't go. I have a meeting tonight.
And so what did you
do? It got to the point where I told him, you are not going to the meeting. You're taking your wife to see the doctor.
And do you remember about how old you were when this happened?
Maybe 18.
Okay. And so Scott would have been about 10 at the time? 9 or 10?
Yeah, 10, yeah.
And so is that... The abuse started tapering off as you got older and bigger than Larry, you said. And so was that
right
when you were in high school?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
More so after, I would say.
Okay, but so Scott would have been 8, 7, 8, 9.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned, I think you said you're the same height now that you've been since you were 12.
I was 12 years old. Yes.
How can you tell us how tall you are?
I'm 6'1".
Okay.
My father, maybe, I'm guessing, was maybe about 5'8".
And you also mentioned that your father was concerned with his outward appearance to others. Is that right?
Yes, he was. It was a big thing.
Can you give me an example of something that he would do for neighbors that he wouldn't do for you?
Yeah, my father was always willing to help out a neighbor where he wasn't necessarily willing to do it at home. We had a large wooded area with a pond near our house, and we always wanted a tree house. And my father was very skilled, much like Scott is, with being able to construct things and very good with tools and stuff. And we wanted my father to build us a tree house. And my father never would, but he would build one for children in the neighborhood. He'd build them tree houses. We pretty much felt that if you wanted something, you were better off not to ask my father, because you wouldn't get it if you asked for it.
Was there a time where he gave you a bicycle?
Yes, again, it was sort of, my father always had to have the newest and latest things, and, that's nice in a way, but if a boy in our neighborhood, it was his birthday and he had got a new bike, I wasn't particularly interested in getting a new bike. I was completely happy with what I had. But several days after that boy got his bike, my father brought me home new, at that time it was really special, a 10-speed English racer. And, it wasn't anything I wanted. I had to appreciate it, of course. But again, it was more like keeping ahead and wanting to be one step ahead of everybody else.
Okay, and you mentioned that no one outside the home knew what he was doing in the home. So is that something that you felt like he would turn on and off, the yelling and the fighting?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He was, he could be the first person outside the house to stick out his hand and smile and, oh, hi, how are you doing? And, a lot of people thought he was just a great guy. Which,
okay. And can you tell me about his involvement with the Boy Scouts?
Yes, when I was in 6th grade, they had a representative from a Boy Scout council come to our classroom and talk about Boy Scouts and how they were starting a new Boy Scout troop in town. And I thought, well, it sounds fun and ideal for me, and it'll get me out of the house, and I'd like to do that. So a parent had to bring you to that meeting that night. My father brought me to the meeting, and as they're sitting there, everybody's sitting there, they said they needed somebody to be the new scoutmaster. Well, I looked, and my father stood up and volunteered to do that, which did not particularly make me happy, but my father continued on with Boy Scouts many, many years after my involvement and my brother's involvement, including Scott's. And he participated for years and years and years.
And so did he go on Boy Scout trips and Boy Scout meetings and events without you and your brothers?
Oh, yes. I mean, he went to trips with Boy Scouts to New Mexico and lots and lots of places, yeah.
Okay. Now, did Scott seem to try to have a relationship with your father?
He did. He did.
Can you give me an example?
Scott would sit and he would watch baseball games, and he would just tag around with my father and try to do the things my father did. Whether it was like building things or whatever, he was a companion to my father.
Did you perceive that Scott was the favorite son because of that?
Yes, I think
And-
my brother Bob may feel the same way, but yes, we always felt that Scott was the favorite son
But,
because my father and Scott spent the most time together.
Now, was your father still emotionally abusive to Scott?
Yes, oh yeah, yeah.
Was he still? I mean, did he show Scott any more affection than he showed to anybody else?
I don't believe so. On the surface of it, I don't believe it. But as kids, we sort of perceived that he did simply because he would spend time with Scott,
Okay.
where he never spent time with us.
Okay. And now, when Scott was born, your family lived in Bridgewater, Massachusetts.
Yes, that's correct.
And can you tell us a little bit about the house that you all lived in?
Yeah, we lived in my parents had bought this house a few years before Scott was born. My father put on I guess, a breezeway on it and a garage and an indoor patio on one side of it. And had done lots and lots of work on it. On the interior, they had all brand new furniture. I mean, it was really a very attractive house.
Okay.
We had a swimming pool.
I'm sorry
Go
to interrupt
ahead.
you. I want to go back to the photos that I sent you. There's one
Yes.
called that's identified as M, as in Mary.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And is that the house that you're talking about?
Yes, that's it. But it's not a particularly good representation of it. I mean, the landscaping hadn't been finished at that point, and if you note on the left-hand side of the photograph, that area is unfinished, and it
Okay.
doesn't show the other house.
And is that Scott? I know you have a smaller version. Is that Scott on the front stoop?
Yes, it is, Scott. Yep.
Okay. And Judge, at this time, we would move Defense Exhibit M into evidence as Defense 2.
No objection.
Without objection, what's been marked for identification as Defense Exhibit M is admitted evidence as Defendant's Exhibit number 2.
And Mr. Nelson, you've got another photograph labeled N, as in Nancy. And, you know, looking at it by yourself without showing us, what is that a photo of?
Scott.
And is that at the same house that we just looked at in the photo?
Yeah, that's the same house on the side of the garage where they had a rose garden, collection of rose bushes, and yeah, that's Scott.
Okay, thank you. And Judge, at this time, we would move into evidence Defense Exhibit N as Defense 3.
No objection.
Without objection, what's been marked for identification as Defense N is admitted evidence as Defendant's Exhibit 3.
And when you lived in Bridgewater, did you live near extended family?
Yeah, excuse me. Some of my mother's relatives lived in nearby towns. The closest, however, were my father's side of the family. They lived in the next town, and we saw them frequently.
Okay, and so you had lots of cousins around?
Yeah, I saw cousins almost every weekend. We would go to my grandparents' house, and my father has, including himself, 8 brothers and sisters, and I had 36 first cousins on that side of the family, of which I was the oldest male. And people would show up off and on every weekend throughout the days.
Okay, and in 1973 is when you graduated from high school, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And shortly after that, did your family move from Massachusetts to New Hampshire?
Yeah, probably within a week of my graduating from high school, my family relocated to New Hampshire, where my father had bought a general store.
Okay, and was this precipitated by your father losing his job?
Yes,
Can you
yes.
can you tell me about that? Was there something suspicious about your father's getting fired?
There was. My father had apparently always liked his job, and I'm not quite clear on what happened. Couple soon before that, my father and a coworker of his had gone out to lunch in Boston, and they went to this Italian restaurant. The gentleman he was with got up and went to go to the men's room, and he opened a door, and he stepped through the door and went down into a hole in the ground. There was a cellar. There were no stairs where they would lower onions and vegetables and things like that to keep it cool. And he fell down there and died.
Okay. And so your father had worked for the state, is that right?
Yes, he was an engineer.
And when he lost his job, you said he bought like a country store?
Yes, he did. They did everything from ground meat, sold gifts, gasoline. Yeah.
And where was that?
In New Hampshire, in Danbury, New Hampshire. It's sort of central New Hampshire.
Can you describe Danbury for me?
Danbury at the time was sort of like a cultural shock for us to move there. It was very small, very rural. There were less than 20 people, probably between the ages of a year old and 25 years old, that lived there. And there was really no activities for children. The thing to do was to sit at a picnic table by a railroad track, and that's where people gathered every day. And that was within sight of my parents' store.
Okay, and so
And
did you and your family live above the store?
yes, we did.
And can you tell me about who was running the store and where your mother and father were?
Well, it was my father. It was his idea to have the store. But it turned out my father would spend more time going to see his friends that he had met in town, playing cards, going hunting, going fishing. And my mother ran the store. She would take in the deliveries, do that type of thing. She ran the cash register from opening in the morning till later in the evening when they closed. She would greet all the customers. And my mother almost sort of came into her own then. She loved it. She loved meeting, finally getting out of the house and being able to associate with people freely the way she wanted to.
And you all didn't have the store for very long, though, right?
No, at that same time, this was in Danbury, and it was off the beaten track. And a lot of people weren't traveling at that time. This was in the early 70s. And it was also at the same time, the nation was going through a large gas crunch, and gas was being regulated as to how much people could purchase and how available it was at the time. Mm-hmm. So even fewer people were traveling now.
And was the store losing money in other ways?
Yes. Unfortunately, it became sort of help yourself at night when the store closed, as to going in and, oh, you want a bag of chips, or you want some beer or something. And my brother, Bob, pretty much was at the head of that. It's allowing people in to help themselves at night. My mother also, I guess, figured she was going to do what she wanted at the time, but it wasn't particularly helpful. She would take handfuls of cash out of the register all the time.
And
And
so when you moved to New Hampshire, you rarely saw your Massachusetts family. Is that right?
yeah, I don't think I saw my mother's side of the family at all. My father's side of the family, they would come up a little bit, and I would see them. They'd come up to visit, see the store, that type of thing.
Okay. But you didn't stay in Danbury with your family for very long, right?
No, I went away to go to school in Massachusetts
Okay.
that first summer.
And you were mentioning that there weren't a lot of kids in Danbury. Was there a lot of drug and alcohol use that you could see there?
We hadn't unloaded the truck when I got into Danbury within less than half an hour. And people were asking me if I wanted to go and smoke pot and drink with them in one of their cars. That pretty much was all there was to do in that town.
And was Scott pretty much, I guess, left alone by your family and during this time?
Yeah, Scott was on his. Yeah, he was on his own a great deal. Either my father wouldn't be around, or my mother was running the store, and there wasn't much for Scott to do. And as I said earlier, there were very few children in town, and where it was a rural rural area, the children that lived there could live quite a distance from where we lived. In fact, 5 towns at the nearby school, 5 towns sent their children to a 1-story school. I mean, it was a small area, so there was not much for him to do.
Okay.
And another gathering spot was in front of the store. It was like an old church bench in front of the general store, and people would sit there all day. And so Scott would, hear that about drugs and everything else all the time.
And so shortly after that, I guess 1974, 1975, your family moved to Hooksett after the store after you lost the store?
Yes, that's correct.
And your father started a custom home building business, or started working
Yes,
with
he
one?
did.
And
Yes, he and my
I'm sorry, he and his brother did?
he and his brother-in-law, his sister's husband.
Okay. And there were times when you worked in construction with your father?
Yes, there were. Yeah.
What was he like as a boss?
Well, to me, he was not very good. I always, where a lot of people say favorites are played towards the son of the owner, it was exactly the opposite. I would be given the worst jobs to do. I just was not treated well. I was paid less than anybody else, and I definitely wasn't skilled as most of the people. I mean, so I can understand that, but
Okay.
one time.
I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt you there, but this business that he was doing, was your father building a house for your family?
Yeah, in one area he built 5 custom homes, and one of the homes he built was a home for our family.
And that was in Candia, New Hampshire?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And around this time, did your father start an affair with somebody else that he ended up marrying?
My father started building a custom home in a different town for a woman and her husband. The woman became a friend of my mother's, and they would go out and eat sometimes or go shopping. And it ended up that my father started having an affair with her, and she divorced her husband and spent time with my father. And after a period of years, they ended up getting married.
And Scott was 12 when your father left your mother?
Yeah, probably about that age, yes. Yeah.
Can you just tell us how Scott's life changed upon your father leaving your mother?
Oh, yeah. I had moved out of the house. I wasn't around that much. And Scott, his whole life had changed. I mean, economically, it was completely different. My father was not somebody who wanted to give anyone money. That wasn't happening. And Scott probably endured quite a bit with my mother's emotional problems going through the divorce and the fact that someone she considered a friend was now going out with her husband, and there was a lot going on. Plus Scott's age. I mean, he's a young adolescent, and very, very bad time, for a boy like that, and who was attached to his father. It was his way of getting out of the house and doing things. Do things as my father.
So
And that
you mentioned
was
that your
over.
okay, and you mentioned that your father didn't like to give money. Are you talking about child support? He wasn't paying child support?
No. It was not something he wanted to do at all.
Foundation.
I'll sustain the objection.
Are you familiar with your mother's economic status after your father left?
I often gave my mother money. I
mean,
would
did you
bring
see-
food to.
Did you see how her... Well, let me break it down. Let me ask you this. Was she and Scott able to stay in the custom home that your father built?
No, they had to make plans to move, and at one point there was no heat, or the heat wasn't working, or whatever. It wasn't being delivered anymore, and they started actually burning furniture in a fireplace for heat
At the custom home.
at the custom home. Yeah.
And then did she and Scott end up moving?
Yes, they did. My mother had a friend, and the friend owned some different real estate, and she was able to buy a old trailer at a trailer park, and that's where they went to live.
And was
So it was
that
quite a...
was that in Allenstown?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And did your mother have to find a job?
Yes, my mother found a job. She went and took classes so that she could get that job, and she ended up going to work for the Registry of Motor Vehicles in Concord, and she stuck with that job for 25 years or more
When you say
until her retirement.
okay, when you say she took classes, was that like a government program to take a class and then get into a job?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
And did your mother appear to struggle with money?
Yes, it was difficult. Yeah.
Once your father
It's
left,
very
I'm sorry, the delay is, I don't mean to cut you off, Mr. Nelson.
That's okay.
Once your father left your mother, did you and your brother stop seeing your paternal side of the family, those cousins?
Once my parents were divorced, my brother Bob and myself, I never saw them again.
Okay. And in this trailer park, was it just Scott and your mother Joan living in the trailer?
For the majority of the time, my brother Bob, I think, stayed there for a while, but most of the time it was just my mother and Scott, yes.
Okay. And you mentioned that it was a lot for Scott to deal with his mother's issues that she was going through. Did his relationship with your mother appear to change or go through some kind of...
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. When I had been at home, I somewhat was like a replacement husband, and she would confide in me, and I would help do things, but when there was just my mother and Scott took over, but he took on far more responsibilities than I had ever had. Scott would crawl under the trailer in the winter, and he'd try working on the heat to get the heat going in the house, repairing a washer and dryer, and maintaining the trailer. And he was just a kid. He did an awful lot around there, as combined with the emotional part of it all, which to me would have been extremely overwhelming to deal with at the time.
Okay, and did your mother also rely on Scott for financial support?
Yeah. Scott would give her money and stuff. He wasn't shy about doing something like that. Scott was always a really, really hard worker. I know one time, and that's something that people had always said about him. One time he worked for the summer. I believe it was doing some type of landscaping. And he saved up money and he bought himself a car. And I remember going over there once to visit, and I go, well, what happened to... I'm sorry. I said, what happened to Scott's car? And he's only in high school, and found out that he had sold the car so he could give my mother the money. And he was like, that's okay.
You said that was when Scott was in high school?
That's correct, yes.
And I want to talk about the last photo that I sent you. It's photo K.
I'm sorry, Aaron. Members of the jury, in just a moment, we're going to take a brief recess. During the recess, you're going to leave your notepads and your pens here. During the recess, you're under all the court's instructions, including but not limited to the instruction not to discuss this case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Please follow the deputy in the jury room. We'll bring you back as quickly as we can. Thank you. Mr. James Nelson, can you hear me?
Yes, Your Honor, I can.
All right, yeah, we're taking a brief recess, so if you need to use the restroom or take a break, this would be a good time for you to do that, sir.
All right, fine. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, we'll be in a brief recess.